Good morning, lords and ladies, and welcome back to A Morning with the Lord. Unfortunately, it has been a while since my last podcast. I do apologise, but things have been hectic. But let's get back into it. It's just me this week. There's no Azza with us, unfortunately, but then it is actually the morning here. Azza has a tendency to sleep a fair way through the day. Got a few stories lined up here from the BBC. We'll see how long it takes us to get through them. I'm going to kick off with Elon Musk. And apparently he threatens to walk away from the Twitter deal. If you have heard this story, Elon Musk has obviously put in a $44 billion bid to take over Twitter. And it looks like the deal might not be going so well. They tried really hard to stop him. It was actually really funny. But even if he does walk away, all this has done is made him extremely bloody popular. Let's read it. It says Elon Musk has threatened to walk away from his $44 billion takeover of Twitter, accusing the social media company of thwarting his requests to learn more about its user base. In a letter filled with regulators, Mr. Musk said he was entitled to do his own measurement of spam accounts. The letter formalises a dispute that has simmered for weeks after Mr. Musk declared the deal on hold pending further information. Twitter has defended its estimates, but Mr. Musk has said he believes spam and fake accounts represent a far greater share than the less than 5% of daily users that Twitter reports publicly. As Twitter's prospective owner, Mr. Musk is clearly entitled to the requested data to enable him to prepare for transitioning Twitter's business to his ownership and to facilitate his transaction financing. To do both, he must have a complete and accurate understanding of the very core of Twitter's business model, its active user base. Lawyer Mike Ringler wrote in the letter. Based on Twitter's behaviour to date, and the company's latest correspondence in particular, Mr. Musk believes the company is actively resisting and thwarting his information rights, the letter said. This is a clear material breach of Twitter's obligations under the merger agreement, and Mr. Musk reserves all rights resulting therefrom, including his right not to consummate the transaction and his right to terminate the merger agreement. The dispute has raised more doubts about the future of the takeover, which Twitter's board approved in April. Well, there you go. It honestly would not surprise me if Musk really wanted Twitter. He could just easily make his own. If Trump can do it, Musk is that popular now and has cemented himself as this sort of champion of free speech. So, I think, why spend $44 billion buying Twitter when you can just beat them at their own game now? Not that that's what he's doing, it doesn't say that in the report, but I don't know. It'd seem like a way to go. That's enough of that story anyway. It doesn't really differ much from that sort of information, basically. Yep, basically it's just that. Well, let's move on to the Pacific. Now, anyone who has been paying attention to Pacific and China tensions in Australia, the Chinese were moving in and setting up base operations in the Pacific and PNG and stuff, which, you know, has always been Australia's neighbour, and we've been there for years, and it's caused a lot of tension around the area. And, you know, it's also, a lot of information has come out about how big business and us have, like, we've helped big business rip them off and stuff. It's no wonder these countries are going to turn on us eventually. But apparently Anthony Albanese's been over there. He's Australia's new Prime Minister, and he is trying to patch up the deal so we stay good. Let's have a read here. Australia has long been considered a big brother by many small Pacific nations, but its approach in recent times has been tearing the family apart, some say. This is something the country's new government wants to change. Big brother's an appropriate term there, because most big brothers are dicks. You claim the Pacific Islands are your brothers and sisters, and then look away when your brothers and sisters are having trouble, says Reverend Elon. I cannot pronounce this last name properly. I'll spell it out. Taumoepeau. He is a Tongan Australian church leader in Sydney. The key aggravator, some say, has been the reluctance of previous governments in Australia to act on climate change. It is not a crisis anymore for the Pacific Islands, it's an emergency, says the Reverend, who describes his homeland as an island paradise that is drowning. Across the Pacific, rising sea levels, cyclones, storm surges, and even droughts are making everyday life tough. Under the previous Morrison government, Pacific countries were essentially told, you take the money, then shut up about climate change, claimed ex-Prime Minister Sapowaja in 2019. That's a mindset Australia's new government under Prime Minister Anthony Albanese wants to dispel. In fact, it's declared a new era for Australian engagement in the Pacific. A lot rides on the strength of Australia's relationships in the region. Many of its closest neighbours are in the Pacific, and Australia is counting on them to resist growing Chinese influence, which it views as a huge threat to national and regional security. So how does the new government plan to patch things up? While Australia's working relationships have remained strong, its image has been badly tarnished thanks to its stance on climate change, say some analysts. Several leaders took a great big stick to the previous government on the issue, historian and author Patricia O'Brien says. She also points to the time when newly appointed Liberal leader Peter Dutton was caught on camera joking about rising sea levels affecting Pacific Island nations, as the Prime Minister Tony Abbott chuckled beside him. The Pacific have not forgotten that, Dr. O'Brien says. In 2019, Fiji Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama, can't pronounce that either, let's spell it out, Bainimarama, had blasted Mr. Morrison as very insulting and condescending. The last month appeared to take another swipe at him over a comment calling the Pacific Australia's backyard. Fiji is not anyone's backyard. We are part of a Pacific family, he said. But with the election of a Labor government that has promised to make up for a lost decade on climate action by cutting emissions faster, the key tension in Australia's regional relationships is gone, says Dr. O'Brien. Labour's new Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, says she, as someone born in Malaysia, has a personal understanding of lingering colonial attitudes and promised to speak to the Pacific with more respect. She also declared that the new government was committed to real climate change. Says here, I understand that under past governments, Australia has neglected its responsibility to act on climate change, ignoring the calls of our Pacific family to act, she said in a speech in Fiji last week. I want to assure you that we have heard you. We will stand shoulder to shoulder with our Pacific family in response to this crisis. Ms Wong announced that Australia would set up an Australia-Pacific Climate Infrastructure Partnership to support climate-related infrastructure and energy projects in Pacific countries and Timor-Leste. Well, it's about bloody time. I mean, all jokes aside, we got so much tech, it's ridiculously just a joke that we can't try and move on a little bit. Let's live in the future. It's time. There's a subheading here saying dialing down rhetoric on China. We'll have a quick read of that. And as they show progress on solving the Pacific primary concern, Australia is hopeful it can convince them to help address theirs, and that's China. Earlier last week, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi embarked on his own marathon tour of the region. Australia was quick to launch a competing visit, sending out Miss Wong to Fiji to reinforce ties with the Pacific family within just days of her appointment. The trip came as China had earlier this year signed a broad security pact with the Solomon Islands, sparking fears of greater Chinese influence in the region and a prospect of a possible Chinese military base. Beijing offers Pacific nations support like quick aid or loans and policing assistance. Policing assistance. But much of this has been criticised as debt trap diplomacy. Oh yeah, like we can bloody talk. Hopefully the Labor government isn't going to do that, but geez. I was listening to Russell Brand the other day, and he was doing a YouTube video about the war in Ukraine, and apparently all the aid that we've given them, the money and the whatnots that the Western banks have offered them, is at 300% interest. 300%. What the hell is that? Those poor bastards sell their soul, and they're still getting fucked. There is a story about that here coming up, but we will finish this one off. The Albanese government says the situation is evidence its predecessor dropped the ball in the Pacific, leaving the door open for Beijing to threaten Australia's national security. But Mr Morrison defends his government's approach, saying it couldn't go stomping around telling leaders in Pacific Islands what they should and shouldn't do. That's true, says political analyst Dr. Richard Herr, but the way it spoke about China's dealings in the region probably didn't help its cause. Mr Morrison had referred to a Chinese military base in the region as a red line for Australia, while then Defence Minister Dutton said the country needed to prepare for war. The rhetoric made Australia look overly sensitive and reactive to China, says Dr. Herr. Australia will have to accept Beijing will inevitably play a role in the Pacific, and the new government will need to make itself the more attractive partner, he says. We can't do things that will exclude China from the region. This would be unrealistic, as Pacific nations also accept aid from other countries and pursue their own friendly relations. Which is, I guess, fair enough. Fair enough. Makes you wonder which one out of those two really seems like they're going around telling people what to do. Alright, now moving on to the BBC's story on the Ukraine. Titled Ukraine War. Severodonetsk and Lysychansk are dead cities, says Zelensky. My apologies for my mispronunciations, but I will leave a link to all these stories if you are interested to check them out. It says here, Ukrainian forces still holding out in the eastern city of Severodonetsk are outnumbered by Russian forces. Both sides fought for the city in the street-by-street battles on Monday as artillery shells rained from above. The intensity of fighting there and in nearby Lysychansk has made them both dead cities, Mr. Zelensky said. If captured, the two strategic targets would deliver Russian forces the entire Luhansk region in Ukraine's east. Since pulling its forces back from the Kiev region in March, Russia has refocused its military efforts in Ukraine's eastern Donbas, making slow advances there in recent weeks. Despite the Russians' superior numbers, Mr. Zelensky said the Ukrainian defenders were holding out and had every chance of fighting back. Artillery strikes have also intensified on neighbouring Lysychansk, which Mr. Zelensky said he had visited on Sunday as part of a tour of the Eastern Front Line. An elderly resident in the city, Alexander Lekyovets, said a Russian missile had struck his flat soon after, engulfing it in flames. They shoot here endlessly. It's a horror show, the 67-year-old told AFP news agency. Russian forces have made slow progress in Ukraine's eastern Donbas in recent weeks. Their troops currently control almost all of Luhansk region, as well as a significant proportion of the neighbouring Donetsk region. The two regions make up the Luhansk. Fighting has been slow and bloody, with both sides sustaining significant losses. Russian state media said on Sunday that one of the army's top officials, Major Gen Roman Kutuzov, had been killed while leading an offensive on an unspecified Ukrainian town in the region. Western countries have responded to the grinding conflict with pledges to send even more advanced long-range weapons to Kiev that they hope will bolster Ukrainian defence capacity in the east. On Monday, the UK confirmed that long-range missile systems would be included for the first time in their next batch of military aid that is sending to Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin has said he considers any delivery of long-range weapons by Western countries to be a deliberate attempt to prolong the conflict, and he said Russia would respond by expanding the list of targets that it was striking across Ukraine if longer-range weapons were sent to his adversaries. In Mariupol, which was captured by Russia in May after a months-long siege, the Associated Press news agency is reported that dozens of corpses belonging to soldiers who had been defending the city's steel mill had finally been returned to Kiev, where they were undergoing DNA tests. Other soldiers who survived the siege were taken to Russian-controlled areas on Monday. Mr. Zelensky said that more than 2,500 of them were being held as prisoners of war. Residents in the now controlled port city have been facing a growing humanitarian crisis, compounded by severe shortages of food and water. On Monday, a Ukrainian official said contamination from decomposing corpses and rubbish had sparked a cholera outbreak, prompting a citywide quarantine. "We're seeing the city get closed off," said Petro, who is an advisor to the city's mayor, to the United News TV. The word cholera is being mentioned inside the city among occupying authorities and their handlers, he added. The BBC has not been able to independently verify this claim. So Ukraine still battling on. Alright, moving on to the last story I have up here, and this is from South Africa. It's titled, "Wealthy Gupta Brothers Arrested in UAE." Two brothers from the wealthy Gupta family have been arrested in the United Arab Emirates, the South African government has announced. Utal and Rajesh Gupta are accused in South Africa of profiting from their close links with former President Jacob Zuma and exerting unfair influence. Extradition talks are taking place with the UAE, South African officials say. The brothers fled South Africa after a judicial commission began probing their involvement in corruption in 2018. They are accused of paying financial bribes in order to win lucrative state contracts and influence powerful government appointments. Many of the most serious corruption allegations levelled against the Indian-born brothers focus on their relationship with Jacob Zuma, who was President of South Africa from 2009 until he was forced to step down amid a storm of corruption allegations 9 years later. The Gupta family is accused of using their close links with Mr. Zuma to wield enormous political power across all levels of South African government, winning business contracts, influencing high-profile government appointments, and misappropriating state funds. Mr. Zuma and the Guptas deny any wrongdoing. After the brothers fled the country, South Africa negotiated an extradition treaty with the UAE in 2021, and President Cyril Ramaphosa's government said it hoped the agreement would lead to the return of the Guptas to face charges, but it was not immediately clear following the arrests whether the brothers will return to South Africa. So there you go. I thought that would be, I like investigating a little bit of the corruption. I'm sure there's absolutely tons of it everywhere, but, you know, remember these names, they're obviously important. They quite literally have influenced the control of countries. And I find the ability that can even really happen interesting. But, I mean, of course it can. I mean, fucking hell. I find, you know, working in a small sort of business like a supermarket or something here in Australia, and you realise that there is power games fucking everywhere. I mean, even in just small friend groups you get this shit. So, I guess it's not that surprising. If anything, it's par for the course. But interesting nonetheless, had to be vigilant, as they say. Well, thanks for joining me on the return of A Morning with the Lord. Another return of it, anyway. There wasn't too much to rant about this time. I notice there's a clear trend when I go for the BBC or ABC that the stories generally tend to be at least fair. There's nothing to complain about. It's not until you go prime news. We'll do that next time. We'll get back into it. Don't you worry. But until next time, lords and ladies, thanks for joining me.